Hi, this is Andy XL back with another NFXL podcast, looking at the fantasy pick world for this week 10, and I'll start with the quarterbacks. Who's my best quarterback to start this week? It's some fella called Josh Allen, who I believe plays for the Buffalo Bills. So Dallas and Cincinnati are on bye this week. They would be the two best opponents of fantasy quarterbacks to come up against, but the Bills get the next best in the Dolphins, who have allowed 4 rushing touchdowns to quarterback this season, which will help Josh Allen's cause along, as well as they'll just concede plenty to Buffalo full stop. So with the Bills being in great form right now, Allen's my number one fantasy quarterback for this week. At 2, I've got Jared Goff. The Commanders are another good team to face as a fantasy quarterback this week, and with their season tanking rapidly on the back of bad losses and injuries, it looks like a great bounce back opportunity for Jared Goff after last week. At 3, I've got Caleb Williams of the Chicago Bears. Williams gets good opposition in the Giants for him to face in week 10. He's been a borderline starting option this season, but this looks like a week to have him in your starting lineup against a Giants team that give up plenty. At 4, I've got Matthew Stafford of the LA Rams. He's averaging nearly 270 passing yards a game and has thrown for 21 touchdowns in 8 games, with 9 in his last 2 games. Now, the 49ers may give up those sort of gaudy numbers, but Stafford is still a must-start option in week 10. At 5, I've got Justin Herbert of the LA Chargers. Prior to last week, Herbert could well have been my number one option this week, but the injuries to the Chargers O-line that provides his pass protection make him less appealing than that. And also against the Steelers D that allowed more yardage per game than any other team, I still think he will put up a good showing, despite the improved performance of the Steelers defense last week that also dropped him down this list a bit. But Herbert's still a solid starter at 5. At 6, I've got Bo Nix of the Denver Broncos. Nix has been a number 5 fantasy quarterback this season, and the Raiders present decent opposition for him to face this week. That makes Nix a solid fantasy option once more in week 10. 7, Jackson Dart of the New York Giants. Dart comes up against the Bears, who are 7th best team for opposing quarterbacks to face this season, 5th best this week with the top 2 being out. And across his 6 starts, has been a top 10 fantasy quarterback himself, which makes Dart another solid starting option for week 10. And the final one I've got in here, 8, I've indulged myself with going outside the top 5, the buy side of the quarterbacks. Bryce Young of Carolina. The Panthers are in good form and come up against a Saints team that is spiralling downwards. The Saints have been nice opposition for passing quarterbacks to come up against. Young has pretty much been a pocket passing quarterback this season, so he fits the type that do well against the Saints, making him a good low-end starting option in week 10. So they're the ones I'd look at starting quarterback-wise. These are the ones that I'd be thinking, don't do that. Geno Smith of the Las Vegas Raiders. Don't get deceived by the arrival of Rashid Shaheed. Yes, on paper, his joining Jackson Smith and Jigba and Cooper Kupp give the Seahawks a strong wide receiver trio. For sure, Smith and Jigba is to be feared, but Kupp has just 2 games this season with more than 50 receiving yards, and Shaheed, who also has to adjust to a new offense, averages just over 50 yards a game this season. Even without Patrick Surtain, the Broncos' pass D is still one of the best around, and with Smith throwing a joint league leading 11 picks this season, don't be fooled into starting him against Denver. And similar applies to Tua Tagovailoa of Miami. Buffalo are nearly as tough a D for a fantasy quarterback to face as the Broncos are, and like Geno Smith's, Tua has struggled badly this season. He averages fewer than 200 yards passing a game, shares the lead in picks with Geno Smith, and offers no threat on the ground either. For me, he cannot be considered a starting fantasy option in fantasy this week. Third one I duck is Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jags. Any quarterback that comes up against this Texans D has struggled recently. They have allowed a season high of 224 passing yards against them, and that was way back in week 1. They've not conceded more than 200 yards in their last 5 games. Lawrence averages a modest 230 yards a game and just over 1 passing touchdown per game. So fewer than 200 yards and no more than 1 touchdown could be on the cards for Lawrence in week 10, so duck him. Another one to duck is Aaron Rodgers of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The Chargers are the 4th toughest team for opposing quarterbacks to face, and they've allowed less than 1 passing touchdown a game this season. Rodgers averages just 211 passing yards a game, and any fantasy value he has largely depends on his red zone efficiency. So against an opponent who does not give up passing touchdowns, that means Rodgers' fantasy value is low for me in week 10. And the final one I wouldn't start at quarterback is Daniel Jones of the Indianapolis Colts. Jones coming into this game off the back of his worst performance of the season in week 9. He was pressured constantly and sacked 5 times in that game, which led to him throwing 3 picks. Now he comes up against another team with a strong pass rush in the Falcons, but is poor against the run. That's the Falcons. And as a result, I can see the Colts relying more on their ground game. Whilst Jones may contribute in that area, the Falcons have allowed just 1 rushing touchdown to opposing quarterbacks this season. So Jonathan Taylor could be in for a lot of work in this game. For just about the first time this season, Jones would be a risky start for me in week 10. Right, that's quarterbacks done in 6 minutes. Let's get on to the running backs. 3 of the best 4 teams for running backs to face are on bye this week. Cincinnati and Dallas feature again, and the Tennessee Titans make up the 3, making the Giants the best team to face for opposing running backs this season, followed by the Dolphins, Jets, Saints and Falcons. And then we need to consider whether the teams facing them have a shared workload at running back, a committee, or there's got a dominant running back there. So these are my running backs to start. At number 1, unsurprisingly, Jonathan Taylor of the Indianapolis Colts. Taylor's been the best fantasy running back this season. And with the Colts coming off the back of a game where the passing game struggled mightily, they may well be inclined to lean on the running game even more this week. And as they face the 11th kindest team to opposing running backs in the Atlanta Falcons, Taylor looks likely to score really well again in week 10. At 2, James Cook of the Buffalo Bills. It's a great matchup for Cook against a Dolphins team that has allowed over 1,400 yards to running backs this season. Yes, Josh Allen may take some touchdowns away from Cook, but he still looks likely for a very, very big game against Miami. Cook has 600-yard games behind him this season, including 118 yards and a touchdown against these Dolphins in week 3. So my third running back I'd start this week is Quinshon Judkins of the Cleveland Browns. Judkins had his least productive game of the season against New England prior to a week 9 bye, but has had 70 yards or more in 5 of his 7 games this season. So against the Jets team that is 8th best in the league for running back to face, and has now traded Quinn and Williams away, which will help teams run against them. As well, looks like an opportunity for Judkins to get his 3rd 100-yard game of the season and possibly get in the end zone too. So he's my number 3. At 4, Josh Jacobs of the Green Bay Packers. Some may shy away from starting Jacobs against the Eagles, but I think that would be a mistake. Jacobs has scored a touchdown in 7 of his 8 games this season and scored twice in 3 of those. And the Eagles have not been great against opposing running backs this season, ranking as the 9th best for opposing running backs to face in fantasy terms. Jacobs is also averaging 92 scrimmage yards a game with a low of 45, a game in which he did get a TD that game. So there seems little downside but some upside to starting Jacobs this week. And 5, now this is a bit of a joint one, Rico Dowdle / Chuba Hubbard for the Carolina Panthers. The Panthers are on a roll and so is Dowdle. In his last 5 games, he has 764 scrimmage yards and 4 touchdowns to his name. He's absolutely steamrolling. And he could be set to score well against the Saints team that has allowed the 5th highest number of rushing yards to opposing running backs this season. The only wrinkle here is that Dowdle has not practiced this week and has been battling injury. If he starts this game, he will score well, albeit he could be pulled early if the Panthers get a big lead against the Saints. If either Dowdle does not start or you think this could be a blowout, then Hubbard might be a decent option if you're struggling for a fantasy running back this week. And on the flip side now, here are the running backs that I'd be cautious of, starting with Jacory Krosky-Merritt of the Washington Commanders. The nicknamed Bill, as he is, has been struggling recently and is now in a 3-way competition for workload with Chris Rodriguez and Jeremy McNichols. He has just 108 yards across these last 3 games, an average of 36 a game, and now faces the 3rd stingiest team for opposing running backs to face in the Lions. Add to that the likelihood that the Lions will score plenty in this game, meaning the Commanders will likely pass the ball more, and there's absolutely no reason to start Bill in week 10. Second one I'd avoid is Rashad White of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. White is carrying the load in the absence of Bucky Irving and will find it tough to do so against a team that has allowed the lowest yardage to opposing running backs on ground this season. With White getting roughly 70% of his yardage on the ground, this is a terrible matchup for him. 3, Breece Hall of the New York Jets. Hall may be the dominant back for the Jets, but his only 2 rushing TDs came against the Bengals team that pretty much everybody has been able to run against. And to add to that is disenchantment at seeing teammates traded away but not getting out himself, and being against the Browns team that is second toughest on opposing running backs and has allowed just 3 rushing touchdowns all season to running backs. And finding reasons to start Hall in fantasy in this week are all but gone. So don't start Breece Hall. 4, here's a couple of big names coming up here. The first one, Saquon Barkley of Philadelphia. Barkley's averaging 85 yards a game and has 6 touchdowns in 8 games, which make him a decent rather than top-end fantasy option on a weekly basis. Yes, he had his biggest game of the season against the Giants in week 8, but the Giants are poor against opposing running backs. That's not true of the Green Bay Packers that they're facing week 10, who are 5th toughest on opposing running backs this season. Fantasy owners will feel obliged to start Barkley, but he may be a low-end option to do so this week. And the 5th one, another one I've got concerns about, but how can you have concerns about this guy? Christian McCaffrey of San Francisco 49ers, averaging a massive 136 scrimmage yards a game and pretty much a touchdown a game. So he's obviously a must start every week as one of the premier backs in the league. But this week he faces the team that have been toughest on opposing running backs this season, the LA Rams. McCaffrey has a pretty much 50-50 split production-wise as a running and receiving back, which is unusual. So it's important that the Rams are also 8th toughest on backs that running backs as receivers. So it's a tough matchup for McCaffrey this week. That's all I'm saying. Right, 12 minutes down. Let's get on to wide receivers. Top starting options. Note 1, Amon-Ra St. Brown of the Detroit Lions. He's averaging a mere 80 yards a game and just under a touchdown a game. And in week 10, he comes up against the Commanders, who have been the 3rd best team for opposing wide receivers to face this season. And they now have injury issues in their secondary. So better than 80 yards and a score or 2 could be on the cards for one of the very best wide receivers in the game, whether that be real or fantasy. At 2, I've got Rome Odunze of Chicago Bears. Odunze was averaging 67 yards a game and had 5 touchdowns in 7 games before amazingly going without a catch against the Bengals in week 9. How did that happen? That was surely an aberration, and he gets a chance to put that behind him against the 7th best team to face for fantasy wide receivers, 4th in terms of yardage in the Giants. And you would expect the Bears to be keen to get him back on track by targeting him plenty here too, which should make this a good week to start Odunze. At 3, I've got Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons. London has 428 yards and 5 touchdowns in his last 4 games, and that fine run looks set to continue against the Colts team that has actually been okay for opposing wide receivers to face, ranking 11th for wide receivers to face. And if the Colts are their normal heavy scoring selves in this game, then the Falcons will need to pass plenty to keep pace with them, which should help London's fantasy value too. He averages 83 yards a game for the season as a whole, and given his recent form, 100 yards and a score would not surprise me here. My 4th one I'd start is Tetairoa McMillan of Carolina Panthers. The Panthers meet the Saints in week 10 and will expect to put up a good score against them. They should do well by the run, but could also be taken to have joy in the pass game too, as the Saints rank 13th in terms of being the best team for opposing wide receivers to face. McMillan has nearly twice as many receptions as any other Panthers receiver and 377 yards more than the next guy. So he has to be the one to be with here. He averages 62 yards a game and could well add a touchdown to that in this one. At 5, now I shook my head at this one a bit when I was thinking about it, but I'm going with it anyway. Sherry Jeudy of the Cleveland Browns. Nominating a Browns receiver in fantasy is certainly not a common thing to happen, but this could be a rare week where it pays to do so. The Browns come up against what could be a dispirited Jets team, and particularly defense, and they have offloaded their best talent on that side of the ball via trade this week. And Jeudy, like McMillan for Carolina, is clearly the best placed wide receiver to exploit this opportunity. He may have had a quiet season to date, but if you're struggling for a wide receiver this week, Jeudy is an option worth considering. Those to be wary of. Number one, Trey Tucker of the Las Vegas Raiders. Tucker becomes the wide receiver one for the Raiders following the trade of Jacoby Myers, but don't let that draw you to high expectations of him in Week 10. He'll be coming against the toughest team for opposing wide receivers to face in the Broncos, and even though they're without Patrick Surtain, they're still a fine unit. Wide receivers have got some yardage against Denver, but only 2 touchdowns from wide receivers against them this season tells its own story. Tucker averages 57 yards a game this season, but that might be as much as you can hope for here. Another one I'd duck is Khalil Shakir of the Buffalo Bills. The Dolphins have allowed the lowest yardage to opposing wide receivers this season. Shakir did manage to score against the Dolphins in Week 3, but had just 45 yards in that game and averages just 50 yards a game for the season, which makes him a TD-dependent pick in fantasy this week. If he doesn't get a touchdown in this game, he's not really going to score anything of note. Third one I'd avoid is Jacoby Myers of the Jacksonville Jaguars. He fills the temporary void left by Travis Hunter, but will need to learn a new offense in quick time and then succeed against a tough Texans defense in Week 10. He averaged just 50 yards a game and has no touchdowns this season, so for a new team against a tough D, will struggle to get his first score or top his average yardage in Week 10. At 4, another one I'd avoid, and I'm going to have a quick drink of orange juice to keep me going. DK Metcalf of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Metcalf is struggling to get to a 1,000-yard season for the second consecutive year. He's averaging less than 60 yards a game and has become a touchdown-dependent fantasy wide receiver this season. So coming up against the Chargers D that has allowed only 4 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers does not bode well for Metcalf owners in Week 10. Right, final one I would be wary of in Week 10. Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints. Olave, like Trey Tucker, may be expected to improve his numbers as Rashid Shaheed has left. However, the Panthers has been the 6th toughest fantasy matchup for opposing wide receivers, and surely this now means that Olave is going to get more attention now that he's the only act in town, pretty much. He averages 62 yards a game and has just 3 touchdowns this season, but interestingly has none since Tyler Shugg took over at quarterback. So don't go looking for a fantasy Olave branch here. Terrible pun. But on we go. So that's right. That's those done. Still sticking to 6 minutes of position, so I'll crack on and try and squeeze tight ends into this one. Once to start, Sam Laporta of Detroit. He's averaging 54.5 yards a game and has 3 touchdowns in his last 4 games. And now he can keep that scoring run going against the 4th best fantasy matchup for tight ends, the Washington Commanders. Another one I'd start is Kyle Pitts of Atlanta. Pitts is close to Laporta in terms of average yardage at a 48 a game, but has just 1 touchdown this season, and that's been a career-long thing for him because he only averages basically 3 a season if he played a full season. In a game where the Falcons may plus plenty against the Colts, Pitts may have a chance to get a score here against the 5th friendliest team for opposing tight ends this season. So this is one thing the Colts have been nice at. It's allowing other tight ends to succeed. Another one I'd start is Dalton Kincaid of the Buffalo Bills. Miami are another good team to play against for tight ends. Kincaid is averaging 59 yards a game for the season with 200-yard games in his last 3, so could be in for another good showing here. Moving on, Oronde Gadsden of the LA Chargers is another one to start. He's quickly made himself the top tight end for the Chargers and looks a fine rookie prospect. I thought he was a steal in the draft, by the way. But anyway, he is averaging a fine 65 yards a game for the season, but as he has truly emerged, 94 yards and 2 touchdowns in his last 4 games. Has been, 94 yards a game and 2 touchdowns across his last 4 games. Now he gets a chance to build on that against the joint second best team for fantasy tight ends to face, which are the Steelers. But, their defense was much better last week, so maybe a caveat, but he's still a good play for me, I think, Gadsden. Now here's your low end option, Juwan Johnson of the New Orleans Saints. He's having his best year of his career, averaging 44 yards a game. And with Rashid Shaheed having moved on, and like I said, Chris Olave likely to draw more attention from the opposition as a result, Johnson could be the beneficiary of a greater share of the targets. The Panthers are not a bad matchup for a tight end either, so Johnson may be one to look at if you're struggling at tight end this week. Here's some to be wary of, and there's some names in here. Tyler Warren of Indianapolis. Warren is an outstanding young tight end that you're always going to start in fantasy, but I can see the Colts running the ball all day against the Falcons, who have allowed the least yardage and just one touchdown to opposing tight ends this season. Warren had a season low 26 yards against the Steelers last week, and this week may not be much better for him. Another one to be wary of is Luke Musgrave of the Green Bay Packers. Musgrave becomes the tight end one for the Packers now that Tucker Kraft is out for the season, but don't expect Kraft-like numbers from him, and certainly not in Week 10. The Eagles have been nearly as tough on tight ends as the Falcons, so less than 30 yards and no score could be what we see from Musgrave here. TJ Hawkinson of Minnesota is another one I wouldn't start. His numbers indicate he's nowhere near the tight end of a few seasons back. In 2023, he averaged 64 yards a game. That dipped to 45 last season and is down to just 29 yards a game this term. So coming up against a rejuvenated Ravens D that is already good against opposing tight ends, making one not to start in Week 10. Here's another big name, George Kittle of the San Francisco 49ers. Kittle has just 82 yards and a touchdown in his 2 games since he returned from injury, and now comes up against the Rams, who have allowed the same as Kittle's average over those 2 games, just 41 yards a game to opposing tight ends, and just 3 touchdowns to them all season. So do not expect big numbers from Kittle this week. The final one is Colston Loveland of the Chicago Bears. Now, it looked like fellow Bears tight end Cole Kmet was going to miss time, making Loveland a more appealing fantasy option. That may not be the case now, as Kmet has been back at practice this week. Even if Kmet misses this game, I would still have seen Loveland as a dubious starting option. The Giants have actually done okay against the opposition tight ends this season, allowing just 47 yards a game to them. Loveland had a huge game against the Bengals last week, but that game aside, has averaged less than 18 yards a game with no touchdowns. So until Loveland shows that he can do it against better Ds than the woeful one the Bengals have, I would not start him in fantasy. Right, I'm really quickly going to squeeze in the kickers and Ds here. I'm just going to say their name. Here's the kickers I would start. Eddie Pinheiro of San Francisco, Cameron Dicker of the LA Chargers, and Kaimi Fairbairn of Houston. The ones I would definitely not start, Matt Gay of the Washington Commanders, Jake Elliott of the Philadelphia Eagles, and Josh Carty of the LA Rams. And I'll just give you the defenses I would play because I'm running out of time. These are my top 5 defenses for Week 10. Denver Broncos against the Raiders. Number 1, number 2, Detroit Lions against the Washington Commanders. Number 3, the Buffalo Bills against the Miami Dolphins. Number 4, the Cleveland Browns against the New York Jets. And number 5, the Los Angeles Rams against the San Francisco 49ers. So that's my fantasy look at Week 10. I'll be back in a little while with my part 1 of my Week 10 preview of the actual action. So see you soon.